morning, good afternoon, or even good evening, whatever time of the day that you're watching and listening to this video. I'm going to be having a look at the focal lengths that you can use for close-up and macro, going from 8mm right up to 300. So let's get on and have a look at these different ways of doing macro photography. I've shot some different focal lengths. It's all the same kind of subject as a padlock that was on a bridge, and I'll tell you a bit more about that in a moment. But yeah, it's the different focal lengths, 8mm going up to 300mm, and I've used a shallow depth of field and maximum depth of field to show you the difference that you can get. So some of the images are shot around about 2.8, others are at f4, some go up to f16, and some go to about f22. So we're going to start having a look now at the different effects that the change of the aperture can have on the depth of field, and how much depth of field there is within the images. Okay, let's have a look. Okay, this is Wilford suspension bridge which goes over the River Trent. What I really like about this the bridge, it's quite a bouncy bridge because it's a suspension bridge, but also going along each side of the railings is hundreds of padlocks. They're all different padlocks. It's similar to, like, you know, the bridges in Paris where they've got the padlocks on it. So it makes it quite an interesting subject to photograph with all the different padlocks, and doing it at certain times of the day, you know, you don't get so many people coming across the bridge, because if you get a lot of people coming across the bridge, it does bounce, and it does really make photography quite difficult, you know, when, especially if you're using a slower shutter speed, if you're using apertures of f16, f22, obviously you've got to drop down your shutter speed. So, you know, you have to be very, very careful when people are walking across it. But these are the images that are done on the bridge, so we're going to have a look at those now. Okay, before we just look at the images I've taken to show you the difference in perspective, macro photography, and the things that we're going to be looking at today, what we're going to be looking is at the three main things that control our depth of field. So not only are we going to be talking about how to use different focal lengths over the next few days, about, you know, how we can use those with to do macro and close-up and stuff like that, but we're going to be looking at depth of field as well. And the three things which are important when we're looking at depth of field is the aperture we're using, the distance from the camera to the subject, and our focal length. This will determine how much depth that we will have in our image. Okay, in this next part here, what we're going to be looking at is the three different things which can affect our depth of field. The first thing we're going to be looking at is the actual aperture. Now, if we keep our subject at the same distance from the camera, which in this case is 10 meters, and then we change our aperture, we will see how our depth of field increases each time. So for the top section there, you'll see that the subject is 10 meters away from the camera and our focal length remains the same at 70mm. In the first part it's 2.8, so we can see that the depth of field is very, very limited, both in front and behind the subject. The next one is where we change our aperture to f8, and our depth of field in front of the subject becomes greater, but even greater behind the subject. And then on the last part, where we change our depth of field to our aperture to f22, our depth of field increases both in front and behind the subject. So that's by just changing the aperture, how you can increase your depth of field if the subject and the focal length remain the same. Now the second part is distance. If we change our distance, then this will also have an effect on our depth of field. So in the first part, everything is f8 at 70mm, but what we're changing here is the distance to the subject. So if we was 1 meter away from our subject at f8 with a focal length of 70mm, you will see that our depth of field is very minimal. If we then move our subject back to say 5 meters, our depth of field behind the subject increases. If we then move our subject even further away from the camera using the same focal length, our depth of field within front of the subject becomes greater, as well as behind the subject it becomes greater. Now you're seeing the last part where the focal length is actually changing. So if we had a focal length where we keep the subject at the same distance to the camera, if we're using 28mm, you will see that our depth of field is both massive in front of the subject and behind. If we then go on to the extreme where we're using 200mm, our depth of field becomes very minimal. So the three things that actually affect our depth of field that we have to concentrate on is aperture, distance, and the focal length that we're using. We can use all of these three techniques to increase or decrease our depth of field as we like. So again, we're going to be looking at this when we go to Wollerton Hall, and also when we will be working in the studio. So looking at this image here, we have a wide angled image, and we're going to see the difference between the two apertures where we're using 3.5 and using f16. So our focal length is staying the same and our distance to the subject is staying the same. But look how the depth of field is changed by changing it from 3.5 to f16. In the f16 shot, you will see that the depth of field has increased immensely. So you have sharpness almost from the front going right all the way back into the wooded area. So this is giving us a massive depth of field by using f16, and we're using a wide angle lens and we're quite close to the subject. So you know, there again, you can use wide angles as well as telephotos as well as macros for getting close-up shots. In this next section, we're going to be looking at two things: perspective and compression. Compression happens more with the greater focal length. So 100, 200, 300, we get a greater compression happening with those lenses than we would with our wide angle lenses. So compression is basically when your distant subject becomes closer in theory or visually to the viewer. So in example here where we're looking at these buildings, by using a longer focal length lens, it seems that all of the buildings have been pulled very closer to the actual viewer than actually the physical distance between them is showing. So that's compression, where we're pulling stuff together. So we could look at it when we're at Wollerton Hall. You can use the trees as an example. If you shot using a wide angle lens, there would be the greater distance between the actual trees, but if you then changed it to a longer focal length, say 100 or 200, the trees would then appear to be a lot more closer than in reality they are. So that's compression. The next bit we're going to be looking at is perspective. What we're looking at here is perspective, and perspective is when you can mess around with the size of something, and you can either make it look really small or you can make it look even bigger. So in this particular image here, we've got the I think it's a tulip, I'm not too sure. I think it's a tulip. The tulip looks bigger than the building behind because we're using a wide angle lens and getting in quite close to the tulip. So the tulip then ends up looking like it's almost the same size as the building behind. And with the image of the animal, the cow I believe it is, you know, by getting in closer, I don't recommend something with horns, getting too close, but getting in closer to the actual subject, we can increase or make it look even bigger than what it is. So in particular, this the cow, it looks big, it looks powerful, it looks, you know, dooming over you by getting in closer with a wide angle lens, and so you create that kind of perspective. So this is how you can mess around with perspective and create a different kind of illusion within your images. Okay, we're going to take a short break now, and part 2 will be in the next video, up and coming. And in that video we'll have a look at using the 8mm lens and using 45mm lens macro, and using like a 100 and 300, and we'll be looking at how those lenses and the distance and the perspective, depth of field, and all those things work, and how you can use them within your photography. So pop over to the next video now, and we'll have another little bit of a look at focal lengths and macro and so on. Thanks for now.